When we take a look at the fossil record, we can see different time periods where we had a lot of adaptive radiation. What we mean by adaptive radiation is this is very fast evolution from an ancestral species. So what we mean by this is that we see an ancestral species in the fossil record, and then very rapidly we see a whole bunch of descendant species from that. So a lot of daughter species. So here in this little example, we see this one horse-looking ancestral species. Then we see it go away, but we see all of this branching in this tree. So we see the tree suddenly have lots of different tips on it, if you will. Now, when we look at the fossil record, we can see this adaptive radiation take place for mammals. Let's look at the timing of this. Right here at the end of the Cretaceous period, you see this big, rapid development of mammal species. This corresponds, this time period, with that Cretaceous extinction. And so this is when the dinosaurs became extinct. If you think about what that would do to the environment, that's going to take a lot of the predators out of the environment. This is going to open up a lot of opportunities for mammals to evolve further. Prior to this time, mammals were very small species. We didn't have anything much larger than, say, a mouse or a squirrel would be. But once we had this extinction event, we see the rapid evolution of larger species of mammals. And now we have lots of diversity today. So what this is telling us is that adaptive radiation happens in response to some kind of change in the environment. So this could be a change in the predators that are present, which is very likely to be some of the case when we're talking about the mammal adaptive radiation. It could be a change in the environment just from a non-living aspect. So the atmosphere may have a different composition than what it had before. This might also cause organisms to now be able to inhabit different niches, and that would give natural selection some different things to operate on that it didn't have the opportunity to select for previously. If we talk about what we call macroevolution, macroevolution is large changes. So when we talk about major changes in body plans, like the evolution of arms and legs, those types of things, that would be macroevolution. Notice that macroevolution is different from population genetics, which we were calling microevolution. There we were looking at small changes within a population and really looking at allele frequencies. Okay, this is much greater scale than what we talked about then, and this is something that's going to take place over millions of years. So over time, we do have some major changes in body plans that have taken place as we go from one organism to another group of organisms. And there's a number of different things that we can look at for being responsible for this. And one of those is what we call heterochrony. Heterochrony is when you have a change in the timing of development. So you could say the timing of development or the rate of development. One good place to look at this is comparing skulls. If we compare the skulls of chimpanzees to humans, if you look at them in a fetus, the skulls look very similar to each other. When you look at the adults, they don't look very much alike. So we see a very large extended jawbone in the chimpanzee that we don't have in the human. So what has caused this big change is that this lower jaw area in the chimpanzee has a faster rate of development than what we have in the human. So in the human, it's a very slow, constant rate of development that causes it not to change all that much. But when we have the chimpanzee, we have that very fast growth rate, which causes the jaw to be much more elongated. That's what we're talking about with heterochrony. Just that change in development can cause the adult chimpanzee and human adult to look quite different from each other. Another thing that we can look at is what we call pedomorphosis. This is when you have juvenile features in an adult. This is again a timing thing because you have juvenile features that just never went away. Or you might have the adult features sped up so that now you have those even though the juvenile features are still retained. This is kind of a common organism that's used to talk about this because here we have an adult salamander that still retains the larval features. And by larval features, there's still gill slits here that you would expect to just find in the larva and not in the adult form. So this can lead to organisms that look very different, but that really might be quite similar on a molecular level. They may not be that far separated on the evolutionary tree, even though they look quite different. It may just be a timing difference so that the adult looks more like the juvenile, or perhaps, this bone was elongated more than another one just based on timing. Another thing that's really important for major changes in body plans are what we call the homeotic genes. And these are also called the Hox genes. That's for animals. If we're talking about plants, we call them the Madsbox genes. But these are going to be genes that are important for major, we'll call body part decisions. So these genes are responsible for organizing the body plan, really laying out the master plan of where the different appendages, legs, structures will go. If we're talking about an insect like we see on this slide here with this fruit fly or Drosophila, these Hox genes are going to determine which parts are going to be the head, which cells will ultimately become the thorax, which ones will have legs on them, which ones will have wings on them. These genes are important because for these major changes in body plan because they make the big decisions. So sometimes it only takes a small change in one of these that can have a dramatic impact on the way that an organism actually looks. And this is something that has been studied quite a lot in the laboratories. And by manipulating some of these genes, so creating mutations in some of these genes, scientists have been able to create some pretty wild phenotypes for organisms. Here we see a fruit fly that has 4 wings instead of the normal 2 wings. And this is one change in a Hox gene that causes this fruit fly to have an extra set of wings. Here's another example. In this case, we see a fruit fly head, and where you would normally have the antennas coming out, now in the second picture, the picture on the right, we see legs coming out of those same locations. Again, it's one gene change. So notice the big role that these Hox genes are playing in determining what the organism actually looks like. So you can have one change in these, and it might dramatically change the appearance of an organism, such that when you look at them, they may be organisms that don't look very related or closely related to each other at all. But if you actually looked at them on the molecular level, you might see that it is just kind of a minor change that caused this dramatic change in phenotype. If we talk about the evolution of development, these Hox genes have played a large role. So when we look at species that are close together on the evolutionary tree, we can see that their Hox genes are expressed in similar locations. We can see how those genes have changed their expression patterns over time. By expression, hopefully that word is not really throwing you off. By expression, we're talking about transcription. And transcription, if you'll recall from your Bio 1, is making RNA. Or in other words, what I like to call using the genes. So when we're talking about development and how it has changed from one organism to another, A lot of this has to do with how the genes are being used inside those cells that make up the organisms, or really more importantly, where they're being used. So if you change where those genes are being utilized at in the organism's body plan, you can dramatically change what it looks like in the end. So you can change where we have legs, where we have the head placement, any wing placement, and so on. So the last thing to mention and talk about with this chapter is this idea of whether or not evolution is goal-oriented. So is this a process that just works towards producing a very complex organism? Well, evolution is not goal-oriented. Keep in mind that evolution is a random process. And since it's a random process, we're really just talking about the environment, whatever happens to be the environment, working on kind of the materials that it's given in living organisms. So we have that natural selection process, and it really all comes down to natural selection, and we have some phenotypes that are going to be successful in an environment, and we have others that are not going to be successful. So if you have a phenotype that's not successful in a given environment, then that would be a species that's probably going to become extinct. If you have a phenotype that's successful, that organism lives into the next generation. Keep in mind that evolution and natural selection can only work on the material that's presented to it. So we're not specifically changing a phenotype to match up with the environment. We're simply selecting and letting the phenotypes live that work in that environment. A lot of people look at eyes and they talk about the complicated structure of the eye in, say, a human or other, an octopus, other advanced organisms, and they say that that is proof for this goal-oriented process of evolution. Well, really that's just what works in those organisms. So that complex eye type works well in an octopus. So over time, anything that led to that eye being a little more complex perhaps was an octopus that could hunt just a little bit better, or an octopus that could survive just a little bit better. We can look around us in nature and we can also see very simple eye types, and those have remained in nature. So what that tells us is that not every organism needs a complicated eye structure. Sometimes a very simple eye is going to be adequate for an organism to survive. The idea here is that it's not evolution just creating a complicated eye. It's not a goal-oriented process. It's just the eye is selected for little by little and independently in different organisms, such that many of them now have a very complicated eye structure. We can see some pretty big differences in what we would call complex eyes, indicating that they have evolved in multiple different lines independently from each other, just by this process of natural selection, selecting some changes that worked well for that particular species. Keep in mind that natural selection cannot predict the future. So we said it's not a goal-oriented process because we don't know what the environment's going to be like in the future. So we don't know what phenotypes are going to work well for that environment that's to come. So we can never predict that. And if you look at any one kind of evolutionary tree, and here we have the one of horses, we see that over time there were a lot of different horses that evolved, or horse type species that evolved. So we see that in the fossil record. What we also find in the fossil record is that most of these disappear along the way. So we have a hard time tracing and finding a living member that can show us the total path from, say, that ancestral species to where we are today with what we now know of as a horse. So most evolutionary paths in the tree are going to be dead ends. So those are going to be organisms that do become extinct. And we're just kind of getting a glimpse of diversity and what used to be when we look at the living organisms that we have today. We're probably not going to be able to trace them back one by one and see all of the different paths that led from the ancestral species to the species that we now know.